My name is Mike Albu, and I am the director of the Beam Exchange. We provide this space for practitioners of market systems development to share their experiences and their knowledge. Having a few technical, so I'm going to keep my introductions brief. Yeah, I'm having a few technical problems this morning, so I'm going to keep my introductions brief and over as quickly as possible to Matt Ripley, who will be I'm looking at the other speakers.
You're in and out, so maybe Matt can take over.
Would you like me to take over, Mike?
Sounds like I might need to, Matt. I apologize for that, and I'll see if I can be more present later on.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And hi, everybody. So yes, as Mike was just about to say, welcome. Really happy to see so many of you interested in this topic and in the virtual room. I'm going to give a quick introduction to all of the great panelists and speakers we have today. I'll keep it very brief and then hand over straight to Valerie as our first speaker. So of course, the topic today, better systems, better jobs, a closer look at value chain development for decent work. Valerie from SECO, a highly experienced expert on labor law, and currently the Swiss government representative for issues relating to economy, finance and development in the ILO and the UN, will kick off the webinar with some introductory remarks. We will then turn over to Merten Sievers, who is from the ILO and is the coordinator of value chain development and entrepreneurship portfolio in the ILO Small and Medium Enterprises Unit. And Merten will take us through an overview of the ILO's thinking behind using a systems approach to value chain development and give us a sneak preview of the recently released Value Chain Development for Decent Work guide. Then we'd have two real-life case studies, Value Chain Development in action for you, coming from Raji from Gatsby Africa. And Raji oversees Gatsby Africa's funding and support to the Kenya Markets Trust. And the Kenya Markets Trust has sector programs using the market systems approach in livestock, water, and agricultural inputs. We'll also hear from Khairul at the ILO, and he's in the ILO country office for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. He has nearly 20 years experience in value chain development and market systems, and is currently supporting 3 value chain development projects, and he'll take us through one intervention in one of those projects today. I am a consultant working with the ILO's Inclusive Markets and Value Chain Development team. I'm lead author of the recently updated guide on value chain development for decent work, and I'll be taking us through the question and answer session. So please, as the speakers are going along, please do write your questions in the chat box. We'll try and get to as many of them as possible during today's discussion. And finally, Elisa, who will be moderating the Q&A discussion with me, is a technical officer on inclusive markets and value chains at the ILO. She's worked at several UN agencies and NGOs in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia on value chain and market systems development and on innovative methods of entrepreneurship support. So she'll close out and wrap up the webinar for us and point you in the direction of key resources. So without further ado, now you know.
Matt, we're seeing a wrong slide here. Just Isabel, okay. Can you jump back to the intro slide? Okay.
Thanks, Merten, and thanks everyone for bearing with us with the technical challenges today. But without further ado, Valerie, over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this webinar and to make a small introduction on value chain development for decent work. And I have the pleasure to represent the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO. We financially supported the ILO Lab project, which provided expertise and practical examples for the third edition of the flagship guide over the last 6 years. It will therefore begin by, I will therefore begin by providing you some background information on SECO support for the market system development approach and how it fits into our portfolio. After that, I would like to share some of our lessons learned from the lab's final evaluation and our view on the way forward. First and foremost, SECO has a long history of promoting sustainable value chain development and decent work through its economic development cooperation programs. This includes support for different ILO projects, such as Better Work and SCORE, which promote the creation of decent jobs and working conditions across various sectors in global supply chain. Part of our interest in supporting the MSD approach came from a knowledge and evidence gap we identified. We wanted to better understand the root causes behind productivity bottlenecks and decent work deficits. For that reason, we were looking for a more systemic approach to providing decent work outcomes, including a stronger ex-ante analysis of countries and sectors we were going to enter with our project. Through such a systemic approach, we are also looking for a more sustainable impact at greater scale in our development cooperation. The analytical work that was done by the lab over the last few years was also intended to help with measuring and evaluating relevant results, and not only for SECO ILO project, but for other SECO projects along the value chain. Last but not least, the project was set up not only to create, but to institutionalize and share knowledge within SECO and the ILO, but also with the international community at large. Looking at the final evaluation of the lab and the latest edition of the flagship report on value chain development for decent work, we conclude that those goals have been largely achieved. We note the high quality of this work and the MSD approach within the ILO over the last couple of years, and the positive impact within the ILO and the international community. Bridging the decent work and MSD communities has created a valuable and rare expertise that the ILO can now offer. We are convinced that the strategic interest in, the ILO has a strategic interest in pursuing this in line, and that the above provides ample evidence to overcome institutional and other barriers in the future. Coming back to SECO perspective, we want to build on the lessons learned in the last couple of years with this lab project. Together, we are conceiving now a new program that goes beyond improving productivity and working conditions at the firm level in value chain, and applying a systemic approach. We are piloting a holistic intervention at the macro mezzo level, which should overcome many of the critical issues that traditional value chain projects face. So I'm very much looking forward to this new experience and new program with the ILO, and also with two main departments of the ILO. I hope that the latest flagship report and this webinar will provide ideas and concrete suggestions for other intervention aiming to promote decent work in value chain. With that, I would like to close my introductory remark with thanking once again the whole team of Merten and Matt, and congratulate all the team once again, and really encourage all other donors and other partners to use this approach as much as possible. And I wish you all a lively debate this afternoon. Thank you.
Matt, do I just take over? I guess so, no? Thanks a lot, Valerie, for this kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to do a very quick introduction into where we come from as the ILO in terms of decent work. and then shortly dive into the contents of what the third edition of the Value Chain Development for Decent Work guide is all about. So for some of you, the concept of decent work might not be that clear. I find one of the easiest ways of explaining is looking a little bit at what lacks for many people in working in enterprises as employees, as entrepreneurs, and what can we do to improve that situation? Yeah, and so the way we define that is by talking about decent work deficits. So what is lacking in many of the emerging economies for many people, for the largest part of the working population on the globe? For many, there's a lack of employment opportunities. For others, it might really just that they don't have enough income. So the work is considered not to be productive if they can't even generate as much as to come out of poverty, or they might be working in decent hours. There might be an inability to combine work, family, and personal life. They might be even engaged in work that should be abolished. Think slave labor, child labor. There might be a lack of stability and security of work. Think about the tourism sector now in COVID. There might be unequal opportunity and treatment in employment. Think about gender differences. Think about the access of youth to labor markets. There might be unsafe working environments, so occupational safety and health. In agriculture, if you spray too much and you get sick later, then obviously that affects your working life and your health. There's a lack of social security, a lack of social safety nets for many, many people around the globe. There's often a lack of social safety nets that can hold you when you're out of a job. And finally, and this is kind of core to the ILO historical setting, basically, is that some of the key actors on the labor market, like workers and employers, might not have the right voice. And so they might be failing in terms of representation, and workers might not be able to make their voice heard. And this is a starting point for much of what the ILO does, kind of trying to figure out how governments, workers, and employers can work together. So we try to address these with different strategies, and this is where now market systems development come in. In some areas, it's just about the job quantity, or one of the key problems is job quantity, but more often than that, it's about the job quality. So higher incomes would be part of job quality. And in some cases, we can address that by trying to increase earnings relative to inputs, or we can improve working conditions that are not wage related. Now, and many of the market systems programs often work on incomes, but many of you surely also work on some of the other decent work deficits. So what we do very often as an argument is kind of, we try to set people on a pathway towards decent work. And finally, obviously, there's also issues that are sort of in the wider system that connect to labor market functioning. Yeah, and so what we try to do with the Value Chain for Development guide is take a systems approach to address some of these issues. Yeah, and so how do we do it in the guide? We basically look initially at kind of how do you develop a strategy. So that's connected. How do you define the target groups? How do you select sectors, subsectors, value chains? How do you shortlist them? And how do you initially engage stakeholders in that value chains that you might want to work in? You want to treat that carefully, because sometimes if you engage too much with stakeholders at the beginning and you decide then, because there's no opportunity in one of the value chains to go for something else, you might have raised expectations. So you want to be careful how you exactly manage the stakeholder engagement. And then the second part of the guide looks at the analysis of the market system. So basically you're mapping the value chain, you understand what I was just trying to talk about, the decent work deficits, and you identify the key functions in the market system. So we use the donut that all of you know. We basically look at support functions, at rules and regulations, and at the core relationships in the value chain, and really kind of what is pulling the chain, where is market demand, realistic market demand coming from, that can actually help us implementing that program and looking at scale and sustainability. And finally, what we've put a bit more emphasis on after the first and the second guides is on action. So at designing interventions, finding partners, really kind of the trickiest part very often of market systems development programs, where it's really about, yeah, so if you have identified the underlying constraints, what is it you can actually do to address some of these decent work deficits? Yeah, and then how do you measure and learn at the end, which is always an important factor, obviously. So I'll leave you with some examples that Khairul and Raji are going to talk about. This is the cover of the guide and the table of contents. So the 3 parts I just talked about are actually chapter 2, 3, and 4. I think it's nicely structured. We've cut it down from, the original guide was 200 pages. Now we're talking 70. We're very proud of that. You might still find it a long document, but yeah, we're very happy and grateful for everybody that contributed to it. Matt is the main author, and but many people in the field contributed. So thanks for that. And over to Khairul.
Sorry for the glitch. Greetings to everybody. This is Khairul from ILO Colombo. Today I'm going to talk about and share our experience of how we applied market systems approach in selected value chains in a post-conflict setting in Sri Lanka. So I have 2 broad sections. The first section, I'll try to develop the context and background of the project. And the second section, I'll talk about the selected value chains that we're currently working on. And then I'll take one value chain as a case and elaborate further. And finally, I'll share some of the experiences and learning that we have gathered so far. So let's start with the background. So the project is being implemented in the northern part of Sri Lanka, covering all 5 districts of Northern Province. And we are targeting 3,000 conflict-affected households with a special focus on female-headed households, ex-combatants, youths, and persons with disabilities. And our target sectors are agriculture and fisheries. Let me also give a little bit of historical background. As many of us know that Sri Lanka has a history of ethnic conflict spanning over almost 3 decades, and which ended in 2009, but actually it took its heavy toll. 2 most dominant sectors, that's agriculture and fisheries, were badly damaged because of that conflict. But actually the economic growth was always challenged in the northern province, and because of its adverse geography. And even long before the war, it was always challenged. And it also failed to take the advantage of the economic liberalization policies of 1977 of the country, because soon after the war began. And now it's 2021, more than a decade has passed since the war ended. Still, this country is one of the poorest, this province is the poorest among all the provinces. And if you look at the GDP, the graph shows that its GDP at current market price in 2018, and northern province is still at the bottom. So why this change didn't happen? I mean, what was missing? I mean, what was needed to trigger or drive the economy towards a sustained economic growth? As many researchers and think tanks, they found Central Bank of Sri Lanka identified that low private sector investment, this is like a document from 2018, the year that the project began, they identified low private sector investment is one of the key factors that actually fail to generate a lasting or like sustained economic growth. So low private sector investment then automatically comes, what is the business enabling conditions, the business service provisions in the northern province. So we have this, we had this study from Ernst & Young, the management consulting firm, which identified the major reasons for this low private sector investment, where access to land, infrastructure, skilled labor, language, caste and cultural barrier, technology, finance, mistrust, political resistance are the key barriers for low private sector investment. So actually this also what we found when we were doing the value chain assessment and market system assessment, these are the key barriers. So this overall situation actually set the tone for our overall project strategy to promote sustained local economic growth our strategy was to attract private sector investment in potential value chains by offering alternative, innovative, and sustainable business models. So we started our project in 2018. Actually, it was the second phase of this project. The earlier phase mainly focused on post-recovery, post-conflict recovery, while this phase focused on how to promote decent work through promoting sustained economic growth. And for this, we identified like 5 major value chains as the entry points. But as you can see, for each of the value chains, we had different growth strategy. And how did you find them? Basically identifying the leveraging or the pressure points at respective value chains. And for some value chain, you can see, well, the primary production is the leveraging point. For some others, it was processing or at input level. So let's take Groundnut as today's case. So let me give you also the big picture of Groundnut market. The overall problem with the market is low supply from the local production, which is also inferior in quality. And why is it happening? And how is the overall situation? There is increasing domestic market demand, but that is not being made by local production. Imports are increasing, and which is coming from India, which is better in quality and also cheaper in price. So basically, Sri Lankan groundnut local production was losing the competitiveness. So I tried to understand what is happening by further looking into the market systems. So then we find definitely the symptoms first come, and then we try to understand the underlying causes as well. 3 symptoms were identified, like the yield is low, that is production per unit land, production is low. Second, the quality of the harvest, that is post-harvest quality of the product varies from farmer to farmer. And the third one, overall cost of production, which is also partly linked with the yield, is high. So all these actually not encouraging more and more farmers to grow more and more groundnut to tap the opportunity of expanding and growing market demand. And these symptoms are actually the result of a number of underlying causes. If you see all these, like basically poor knowledge of production techniques and post-harvest management, their lack of access to seeds, irrigation facilities, access to finance, and access to farm machineries. These are all resulting into those symptoms and towards the overall market problem. So but another important feature here, you can see what I mentioned, these are actually belonging to the supporting function, but there's also one important informal rules and norms that I want to highlight. As there was like conflict and this mistrust is one of the reasons for low private sector investment. And we can see what is happening. The local farmers in the northern, they prefer to sell to the local intermediaries for years, though they are like, clear evidence of exploitation, but just because of this mistrust and like they're not willing to sell to the outsiders coming, big businesses coming from the south. So this existed, and like this actually one of the findings in the informal setting, informal rules and norm setting. So our overall intervention was to address the overall problem, that is improve farm productivity and product quality. But to achieve that, actually our strategy was to address the underlying causes which were affecting to the overall problem. And how did you do that? By strengthening or developing commercially viable solution provider to those underlying causes. So now we have the underlying causes, and now we try to understand, okay, who have the incentive to provide the solutions to the farmers at farm level. So after assessing different options, we identify large companies, they need more groundnut with better quality. But why they were not addressing the problem by themselves as of now? So we tried to understand what were their challenges. And we found several companies tried to penetrate and like to procure from the north, but actually they failed because they tried, actually they were going to the harvesting time, the farmers are not, or they couldn't dent or they couldn't have built the trust where the farmers would sell them. So we developed our business model so that, and tried to, and started talking to different large companies. So the business model is simple, that no, this going during the harvesting time and asking farmers to sell them will not work. They have to build the trust by developing a business relationship, not for 1 day or 2 days. It has to be built in course of time. So farmers have to see the company is also not only looking them as supplier, but also helping them grow with a mutual interest. So by addressing those problems, underlying causes, a company could be seen as a business partner. But this needs investment, this needs cost, and this needs also a risk of return on investment. So, and there comes our offer to the companies that we say that we are willing, we are ready to share part of the cost of this investment if you try this business model. So after negotiation of several companies, we had our partner. So 2 years have passed, like now we have started seeing the results. And if you see some of the early signs of impact, at farmers' end, now we have started seeing they have improved access to different technical advisory services. They have better access to better quality inputs, and they also have like a better market, which is more rewarding. And at companies' end, they're sourcing. For the first time, that company was able to source from the north and in a large quantity. They have now better quality groundnuts, and they have developed a loyal supplier base, which is also expanding. And if you look at the numbers, these are also very encouraging at farmers level as well as companies level. Now, if you look at the system, I mean, we try to also assess the systemic change to this AAER framework. At adopt level, we found like the company is really happy. The owner, I mean, most of the time in 2020 due to COVID, he was not even in country, but he was constantly monitoring that how the project is progressing. And the farmers are also happy. At adopt level, we saw like that at initial level, the agreement was like they will deploy full-time employment. But at second season, they said like, no, instead of like full-time, they started reducing the time only during the seasons, which made sense because that gave them more value for money. They have started giving inputs on credit because they have built the trust. And finally, this year, what is most interesting, they now have thinking, since the volume from North is increasing, their procurement, they have started to put up a new factory, whole processing plant in the North. At response level, in some locations, what we have identified, the cooperative department has given approval to some of the cooperatives to release loans against groundnut production, which is not the case before. Earlier, it was only for paddy. And at expand level, we have recorded at least one company, one large company is going to copy the same model in this coming season. This is the final share. Let me share some of the experience and learning. Adaptive management. This was very important throughout the project period. And for different reasons, for instance, COVID-19, it came with like unprecedented challenges, the monitoring system, negotiation, communication with the partners, day-to-day activity, everything we had to, accommodate as per the situation. Change in policy environment, that new government came with new policies and regulations, and also it also opened up new opportunities. So we revisited our value chain portfolio and picked new value chain to start implementing because we could benefit out of that. Stakeholder opinions, like we have constant stakeholder opinions, and it also revealed that it's very important to remain flexible in planning and also implementation. The second point, I mean, we all are familiar with this challenge. I mean, there is always this conflict between traditional and non-traditional, market systems approach, because traditional projects is give handouts, and when we ask for transactions and transactional relationship, and this sometimes creates some confusion among the target people and also some sort of mistrust, which is often a challenge. And the final point, the private sector partnership. I mean, this has not always been a smooth journey, and this is not, because as we know that, I mean, we have different priorities, and private companies, until and unless, for instance, they reach the level of adapt, that means they're still seeing this new model as a pilot, but they have their existing ongoing and regular business priorities. But this pushes sometimes us, the project, in a difficult situation because we are limited time-bound project and we have expected result to be delivered or to be achieved in a given time. So this sometimes we need to accommodate. Second point, not all negotiation end in positive outcome, and which is fine. We know that it will not happen all the time. So it's safe not to put all the eggs in one single basket. So we keep our options open. And the final point, I mean, which is interesting, private sector still, I mean, though market systems, value chain approach, and this is getting like strong foothold, but still a large segment of private sector still see us, development sector, as philanthropic organization. They think like we are for charity. And whenever we approach them, initially it happens, like they say, how can we help you? But the moment we starts convincing them, actually our offer is also to help you, your business challenges. At the same time, we will reach our target people and benefit them. They start thinking differently, and then they start asking, how can you help us? So this is something that we found like it's important for us that we clearly position ourselves among the private sector, that we're not philanthropic in this approach. We are also trying to address their business challenges as well as help our target people. That was all from me. Thank you very much for your patience. I'll pass it to my colleague, Raji.
Thank you, Khairul. Just going to try and share my screen. This is Rajan from Gatsby, Africa. Good afternoon, everyone. Just quickly about us, we are a private foundation focused on transforming key sectors in East Africa. We're quite uniquely positioned as a funder and an implementer, and currently have a portfolio of sector programs that are largely implemented by ourselves or through our partner institutions, Kenya Markets Trust and Musingi. Over the next couple of minutes, I'll take you through one of our initiatives that is from a work that we do with KMT, Kenya Markets Trust, in the livestock value chain in Kenya. The livestock sector is crucial for Kenya from multiple perspectives. So economically, it's a significant contributor to growth, employing about 40% of the agricultural labor force and about 15% of the ag GDP. Now, as you can see from the map here, 80% of Kenya's landmass is drylands, or what we call the arid and the semi-arid regions, the ASL regions. 90% of the economic opportunities in this region is provided by the livestock sector. And over 10 million pastoralists are dependent on this region for their livelihoods. Now, these are among the poorest and the most vulnerable population in Kenya and are often socially excluded from mainstream. With increasing climate change, these millions are at an increased risk of losing their livelihoods. Now, having established the importance of the sector to Kenya, let's look at the sector from an opportunity lens. Now, this is really important for us as it forms the basis for any plans to grow the sector and create decent jobs. Now, Kenya is home to one of the largest livestock herd in Africa and possesses really strong comparative advantages. Demand conditions are really strong in the sector. Local demand for meat is projected to grow, and it's increasing. It's projected to grow or double over the next decade. And there are huge export opportunities. However, the sector is currently operating in a very uncompetitive manner and is riddled with supply-side inefficiencies, with an annual production shortfall of over 300,000 tons. So despite all these strong demand base and an abundance of natural resources of livestock, Kenya remains a net importer of meat. Now, this is a typical value chain of the livestock sector. The sector is starting from a very low base with inefficiencies across all points in the value chain. More than 70% of the livestock production in Kenya is done in the ASL regions, the drylands. It's predominantly very informal, and it's largely subsistence-based production systems. Increased droughts, poor animal health, all this results in mortality rates of over 50%. Only 2% of the sector actually goes through any form of cold chain or processing, and there are huge post-harvest losses as well. Now, KMT's vision for the livestock sector is that they can transform it to make it more efficient and ensure that it adds value at every stage in this chain. And for that, they have an end-to-end strategy that covers different parts of the value chain. Now, one of the interventions that we piloted was the introduction of quality and safety improvements in the sector. Through our analysis, we identified the lack of demand for quality meat as a key factor that was inhibiting any form of productivity improvements or value additions. Now, this required the program to stimulate demand for quality meat by working with retailers and processors. To pilot this change, we partnered with one of the largest supermarkets in Kenya, as these are early adopters of most changes, to introduce the concept of food safety and quality control in the meat retail department. We did this through training programs, exposure visits from experts, and literally building the business case for this changed behavior. Simultaneously, we also worked with consumers to shift their preference for meat from hot chain to cold chain. I mean, hot is freshly cut meat to the cold chain. 16 months into our work with Tuskies, they championed this innovation, invested in a centralized processing unit, trained a good proportion of their meat retail staff in international safety standards. They opened up a central cutting line with over 40 permanent employees. The supermarket received its first global certification, making it the first butchery in Kenya to be compliant with HACCP, which is the international certificate for it. Now, for us, the business case was proved. Upon compliance with HACCP, Tuskies was able to grow its revenues by 36% and increase profitability by about 16%, largely from reduction in commercial losses. Now, more interestingly, we had other supermarkets like Naivas and Carrefour, all of them adopting same practices and investing in food safety and also increasing their employee base at similar levels. But this really wasn't enough because supermarkets only account for 2% of the sector. We have majority of the meat that's sold in Kenya is through open markets. And there was also a very strong consumer preference for hot meat. So for that, we commissioned a study which covered 13 counties in Kenya to better understand consumer preferences and retail practices for the livestock products, and partnered with different industry associations and the Export Council to disseminate these findings publicly, largely with an aim to raise consumer awareness of the issue of food safety. This led to increased dialogue in the sector. And we also brokered partnerships with media to raise consumer awareness. Here are some of the impacts that we've been encouraged by. So in the retail end, there are clear signs of replication and adoption by other large supermarkets. Now, this has resulted in increased jobs and income through the supply chain due to increased demand for better quality meat. Now, for example, one of the slaughterhouses that, again, we worked with, they invested in getting the certification and training their staff. And they secured large export orders, which meant within a span of 2 years, they actually increased their employee base. They tripled it from 40 to about 150 in a 2-year period. There's also greater commitment from different industry stakeholders to address this issue of food safety. And quite encouraging for us that very recently in the government State of Nation address, food safety was highlighted as one of the key issues to be addressed. There's also now a clear policy framework to stimulate the kind of change required in the sector. Now, by no means this is a complete story and job done. It's very much work in progress. And with many challenges as it stood, and then new challenges now with COVID. With COVID, what happened is the Tuskies, the supermarket chain that we were working with, ran into serious financial trouble, and they're now close to liquidation. But also not lost because of early adoption of this practice by other supermarket players. If anything, the importance of this measures has only been amplified, and there's greater commitment from all involved. Some of the key lessons we've learned, and there are many lessons we've learned, but just highlighting 4 that feels quite important to us, that using a system-wide lens to tackle value chain efficiencies to help to understand the dependencies and the connected nature of the system, and to design really critical interventions that can catalyze wider changes in the sector. Determining the, secondly, just determining the business case for competitive growth is really key to creating sustained jobs. Thirdly, I think majority of the development initiatives are supply side focused, but it is important to understand the demand side dynamics, because these are really what makes outcomes sustainable. And lastly, and nothing new here, that systems change do take time. And it's important for all of us involved here as development partners to commit to longer term programming. I'll stop there and pass over to Matt.
Thank you so much, Raji.
Matt, there's a problem with the audio. You probably have 2 audios on. Go again. Go again.
Apologies, is that better?
Much better.
Okay. So thank you so much, Raji and Khairul, for those examples of a real-world application of the value chain approach to key aspects of the decent work agenda. We've got about 15 minutes left now, and it's my pleasure to host a Q&A session with the speakers that you've heard from today. So Merten and Khairul from the ILO and Raji from Gatsby. We've already got lots of great questions coming in the Q&A chat box. Please keep these coming. We'll try to get as many answered as possible. Some of the more kind of technical case study specific questions we may follow up with written responses or after the webinar, but as I said, we'll try and get to as many as possible. There were indeed a number of questions submitted by participants when they signed up to the webinar. So I'd like to start with a few of those that came before. And actually, first question back at you, Khairul. And this comes from a participant from the USA, Bureau of Resilience and Food Security, who asks, what are your top tips for success in engaging governments when working on value chain initiatives?
I can make a number of suggestions. Number one could be engaging them. I mean, we should try to engage the concerned stakeholders from the beginning, very onset of the project design, so that they are aware, and they also start feeling a sort of ownership that is not coming from outside, rather they're also part of it. So this is important, that if you could engage them from the very beginning. Second, aligning with the policies, new policies, all the rules and regulations. I mean, sometimes they may be counterproductive, where we have to work how to address them, but many policies and regulations are actually favorable, and how we can align them. And if we can design our program and align with those, so that also encourages them to actively take part in the project. At the same time, I mean, there are different development programs under government. Different departments they also have different targets. For instance, every region, they have if it is agriculture, every province have their annual target to reach this much of production, to extend to this number of acreage. So this also, I mean, if it's an agriculture project, so we also have different targets. So basically they can be seen together, and government can also feel that our target is actually helping reach their target. So that's also an incentive for them to take part and engage strongly. The last point, what I would say, it's also important since we are projects and like we implement in a time-bound context, it's always important that starting from there, like we are engaging them, and in the middle, we are also seeing that they are achieving targets by working with us or supporting us. And finally, we see that if we can ensure that what we have done differently and with visible impacts and more sustainable, if you can try to institutionalize those concepts and ideas and approaches into their, in government departments and policies, that is useful. And that can happen if they are always, taking part, starting from beginning till the end. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thanks, Khairul. Raji, I'd like to direct the next question at you, and it'd be really great to hear your perspective from Gatsby on this. The question was, what do you see as the major difference between value chain and market systems approach? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? I'm sure you could probably write an essay on that, but the top level takeaway would be great.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. And quite a frequently asked question in some sense, isn't it? So I don't know, so value chain per se is a process along a product supply chain where value is added at each stage. The value chain approach actually aims to achieve efficiency along this process for firms to then compete and grow as a means for wealth creation. Now, market systems can be almost seen as a network of businesses, consumers, associations, and a number of other actors who actually come together in an exchange of goods, or it could be services as well. I think the difference between the two is the boundaries of a market system could include one value chain, or it could be multiple value chains. And what's quite distinctive about the market systems approach is its focus on addressing the root causes of underperformance. And by addressing them through changing incentives and behaviors, all with an aim to making these systems more inclusive and efficient. Now, I think while the two approaches have different origins and have come to be thought of quite differently, they are quite complementary and both aim to achieve quite the same development outcomes. The scope could be larger or smaller depending on how you define market systems. I'll stop there, Matt, and if they need a clarification, I can provide more.
Super, thanks very much, Raji. Merten, I'd like to pose the next question to you, and this one comes from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the question was really about how to reach particularly vulnerable groups through value chain development, such as refugees and women in the informal sector. The interventions haven't really touched on that so much today, but how in general can a value chain development approach offer adequate protections for these target groups and do things like get them remunerated fairly and have good job quality?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think it's a relevant question. It comes up quite often, and as many of us operate in what we call thin markets. So in situations where kind of market demand might be hard to grasp, or support services might not be existent, or you have a situation, as you just outlined, with refugees or kind of very far away rural populations where it's the basic conditions maybe to participate in the market, say as a refugee, you don't have the local language, are not given. Yeah. So the further you go down in these poverty levels, or in kind of people being outside of certain networks, the harder it will be to participate in a market. I think, so what we do, for example, when we work in refugee situations is we combine a market systems approach with a few more direct interventions. So say language training, so that people can at least kind of come in and speak that language. I think what we can learn from market systems development, however, is that you always need to ask kind of these long-term questions, kind of how will this become sustainable? How will we reach scale? What is the market demand so that we can actually can guide us in terms of our intervention so that we don't produce something that will just stop at some point when donor funding ends. So kind of keep on asking those hard questions that are coming out of the market systems approach, kind of about scale and sustainability. And there's more questions that you might think, if you think hard enough, that can actually be addressed by a market-driven approach to a certain extent, not everything under the sun, obviously. But I think that's also where sort of the guide tries to kind of provide input in terms of, what are the pathways to more decency of work? So how do you get a step further? It's not a black and white equation in many situations. It's really kind of, how do you get that additional income? How do you get a bit more participation of women in certain situations so that you advance towards decent work?
Thanks, Merten. Circling back, Khairul, I'd like to group a couple of questions together to send them back to you, which were around the pathways to impacting decent work and the different target groups. The questions were, you talked about kind of the farmers' income increasing. What about company employees? Were there any sort of impacts on more wage and formal employment, either have already occurred or plan to occur in the theory of change?
Well, that is definitely one of the areas that, because when you look at the systemic change, if the overall business model is not helping the company, they're not going to continue it. And helping the company means not only the owner, but also everyone involved in this process. So, but this is something that we have to still capture, because we have anecdotal evidences that they are procuring more than before from the north, and they are happy. But how that is impacting their business overall, that is also critical to capture and analyze. That is one. But regarding the employees, and particularly during the COVID time, what we are following, many other employees who could not come, but they were given certain allowance. So, I mean, this is something, it's not that we enforce them, but this is the company policy that they still kept and maintain their employees and workers, and kept them supporting during the lockdown time.
Thanks, Khairul. There is Raji, a really interesting question. I think that's just come in that I'm going to ask you to think about it, because it was directed to your case study, but it's something that's, the update to the value chain development guide has taken on quite squarely, which is, the measurement topic is not an end in itself, but a means to learning and improving and adapting over the course of a project and intervention life cycle. The question is kind of what you presented looks very straightforward and well thought through in advance, but was it, have you made any mistakes, incorrect assumptions, what did you do wrong, so to speak, that actually led to really interesting learning and some pivots or course corrections?
Yeah, gosh, I'm sure we've made numerous mistakes along the way. I mean, for a start, in terms of assuming how much time it would take for some of these behavioral changes to happen, was an assumption I think we've had to change over time. So on the one end of these, so when we're working with retailers and processes, I think that was more predictable. But trying to change the consumer preference of people has taken a long time, and we're still not close to where we should be. We've had different kinds of campaigns. So one has been through these dissemination of studies, helping people to understand the safety aspects and the risk of eating hot meat. But it's just sometimes a taste thing. People prefer the taste of hot meat. And we've had different campaigns where we have cooked meat using both these hot and cold meat and asked people to blindly taste and say which one tastes better. And quite often people say the cold meat tastes better, but still they continue to use hot meat. So that's taken much longer, and it's still nowhere close to where it should be. And it's a constant adaptation in terms of our work and assumptions, that just part of day-to-day programming, I think.
Thanks, Raji. We've probably got time for another couple more questions. And Merten, this one I'd like to direct to you, which is about specifically around the 10 decent work deficits that you presented at the beginning. Are there any experiences addressing kind of particularly ones 9 and 10? So that's social safety nets, workers' representation in market systems or value chain projects. It'd be great to hear of some examples or be pointed in the direction of those.
The guide itself, I don't think has a lot of points on that. So yes and no. We're now starting a program, for example, in Cameroon on that combines kind of work in areas of Cameroon that have had refugee influx. So tries to really try to understand what are the value chains that can absorb kind of more host community and more refugee labor. And at the same time, try to figure out, is there any access we can provide them to social security systems at the national level? What experience shows is that it's very difficult to set up social security systems with small groups of people. So you need a large pool of people, I'm talking hundreds of thousands, in order to actually get something that can be financially viable. And so what the ILO does in social security is a lot kind of trying to extend social security to those that are not covered. And it could be anything, could be cash transfers, but something that is linked to a larger pool of money so that that can become financially viable. And that's sort of one of the crucial kind of, I think, things in social security. So if you're working in a specific value chain, you can try to make that link, but trying to come up with a solution that only works for that value chain is often financially unviable. And so you sit a little bit in that conundrum of kind of, you need something that is really at the policy level and where decisions need to be taken also together with government, which is sort of sometimes far away from the market systems work where people think in terms of kind of what is the market demanding, how can I reach that, and kind of how can I build on that to provide decent work. Now, some of these actors in the market system could be linkages to kind of government schemes to where the kind of larger pool sits, mutuals, service providers, business associations. And so that's what we're going to try out. Can we try to create that linkage between social security systems and those actors in the value chain or in specific regions? But there's not many examples out there. And then finally, business associations, obviously, that they play a role very much and very often. So that side of representation is partly covered at least, but on the worker side of representation, it is very tricky because very often the few workers that are represented in a country tend to be those working in the somehow formal manufacturing sector. Most market systems projects are not there. So one could think about, how, so in the manufacturing sector, we've partly done it with other ILO programs, but in agriculture, say day laborers, etc., it is tricky. You can kind of create awareness campaigns, etc., but doing that based on market demand is hasn't been tried to the best of my knowledge, and there's also limits in terms of how much you can do in terms of market demand. And I think that's an interesting area that still needs to be explored.
Thanks, Merten. And just conscious of time, I know there's lots of interesting questions still coming through. What we're going to do now is shift to hearing from Elisa about where you can find further resources. We'd love to see this as the start of the conversation. So what we'll do is follow up with you individually and collectively on the answers, written answers to the questions that weren't responded to, perhaps more in-depth answers to the ones that were already briefly responded to after the webinar. So thank you very much for all of those questions. And please, of course, do keep them coming in. Elisa, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Yes, I just wanted to take a moment to actually show you where this guide we are all talking about is. So I shared in the chat box the link to our webpage of our team, Inclusive Markets and Value Chains. And so that's what you see now on the screen. You can see the value chain development for decent work guide that we presented today is available on the key resources and what's new. The guide, so you can see the PDF is here in English, in Spanish, and we're actually working on the translation in French and Arabic. And back on the homepage, I just wanted to highlight that here you will find a lot of material resources, more than 100 analysis assessments on different sectors and countries. So we hope you could find something interesting here, and please do not hesitate to take contact with us. I also shared our email address. We are really looking forward to hear feedback on how we can improve a little bit the discussion on this domain, but also hear your experience on how you are using these resources and guides and our material, and how we can also improve these materials as well. So let's keep in touch, and that's all on my side.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And I think Mike is still having some connectivity issues. So on his behalf and BEAM's behalf, I'd just like to say thank you so much to you all for participating today. And thank you so much to all our speakers, Valerie, Merten, Raji, and Khairul. Really much appreciated. And as we said, hope this is the start of the conversation. Really looking forward to your feedback on the new guide and on continuing the learning journey together. Take care, everybody.